And after a well-deserved break from Ken Wheeler, it really is time to close the series off. So far, he has done 5 lectures on the concepts of counter space, incommensurability, polarity, and lots of other nonsense without a single attempt to define these terms, let alone explain these definitions and how they fit in with his framework. He claims to be the only person to define magnetism, and I'm pretty sure that you have all figured out by now that this is a meaningless claim. Firstly, the statement is incorrect. He doesn't define a damn thing. But secondly, magnetism is not a single thing. It is a class of phenomena. So let's look at the 6th and final part of his lecture series.
Okay, so let's make our way to the 6th section of the lecture on defining magnetism. This time, in this 6th section. By the way, if you should take a look at this diagram, which I've showed you before a few sections ago, we actually have the AC current diagram of Charles Proteus Steinmetz. This is the conjugate magneto-dielectric diagram that defines the entire universe. We actually see the same current flowing down the AC power lines, alternating current. The same field geometry between the lines as we'd actually see if we would actually encapsulate this diagram in black, representational of the magnet. We'd have the plane of inertia, the expanding toroid, and inverse to that we'd have the hyperboloid, or the hourglass shape, to increasing inertia and acceleration to the plane of inertia, or the null point in counter space. And here we have, of course, this point source emission. Why do you think, and you need to think about this for a second, hearkening back to section 5, where we actually have point source emanation. In the ancient Greek, the word would be prohodos, defining laser light.
And we start off with being a pretentious dick. Prohodos just means emanation. That is all. Nothing about point sources, coherence, or any of that. No, it just means emanation. It has absolutely no bearing on the presentation, but he crowbars this in to make himself look impressive. Prohodos is also the root of the English word progress, something that Ken is definitely not making with his attempt at explaining magnetism.
You'll say, well, it's coherent light. No, what specifically it is point source light. Everything is, and why is it at the center? Because at the center of a mass, we have the inverse of the mass itself, which is representational of force and motion, inertia and acceleration. You see, the pressure mediation of the plane of inertia, or this null point, if you're actually able to stick a Gauss meter probe between 2 magnets and bring them together to form one magnet, you would see that there's zero magnetic flux. There is no magnetism at the center of any and every magnet.
If only there were another technique to measure this without using a Gauss meter. Here is a measurement of the magnetization inside of a cylindrical magnetic nanowire. Interesting. Now, this is quite a complex magnetic texture inside this wire, but my colleague who works at a different institution fired X-rays at this nanowire, and using some really clever tomography techniques, she was able to figure the shit out. Now, a number of other techniques are available to do this kind of thing. Granted, it is not easy, and it is far from cheap, but it is possible.
You know, this notion of polarity, you need to understand, is the inverse of counter space. Why do you think the block wall, or this dividing line, and it's not a line because it has no location, exists at the absolute inverse of the spatial mass itself? Whatever the mass may be, the pressure mediation of counter space, the block wall, the plane of inertia, it doesn't matter what people call it.
Yes, it does matter what you call it. Firstly, the plane of inertia is not a thing. Secondly, a block wall is a very specific thing, and it has nothing to do with what you are talking about. I had hoped that he would go into this block wall thing a bit more, because he does that in his book quite a bit, but from peeking ahead, I know that he doesn't in the video, so I will just crowbar a bit about them in here. The electric wooniverse people talk about this block wall in the center of a bar magnet. On each end we have the poles of the magnet, and in the middle there is this block wall. Now, Ken is correct in saying that people incorrectly call this a block wall because there's nothing there, but Ken doesn't believe in magnetic domains, so he is correct for entirely the wrong reasons, and his correction is actually also complete nonsense. But anyway, let's quickly run through what a block wall is. We start with magnetic domains. In ferromagnets, you have lots of small regions where all the magnetic moments point in the same direction. And these regions are called domains. In the ground state of a large ferromagnet, these domains all point in directions to minimize the field produced by the actual magnet. So the field produced by each domain is cancelled out by the other domains. Apply a magnetic field and these domains all align, and you are left with a permanent magnet. Well, not necessarily permanent, but you get the point. When we look at two domains, there is a small region where there is a gradual transition from one direction to another, and this is a domain wall. Now, first we have a Néel wall, which is where the magnetization rotates in plane. And then we have the block wall, where the magnetization rotates around the axis represented by the dotted line in the image. Now, in both cases, the width of the domain walls is in the order of nanometers. Now, how do we know that there isn't a big one at the center of a permanent magnet? It's quite simple. You can look at the direction of the moments. According to the electrical universe, this wall sits across the width of a magnet. Now, if this were true, then the magnetic moments on either side of the center should point in opposing direction. This means that the magnet would have two north poles or two south poles on the end and something odd happening in the middle. But this is clearly not what we observe. A permanent magnet is in a saturated state. This means that all the moments inside of the magnet are aligned, so there is only one magnetic domain, so to speak. There is no second domain, and therefore there is no domain wall.
Brings itself not to, as meant place, because it has no Cartesian value, to the inverse of the magnetic force and motion in the actual spatial mass itself, because this is necessitated. This is, as I mentioned before, the ancient Greek word ananke. It cannot exist any other way. I mean, that is the resting or the lowest pressure point between force and motion, i.e. magnetism. This is the conjugate magneto-dielectric geometry that defines the entire universe. So let's go on to defining magnetism. And of course, oh my goodness, take a look at this. Here we have the electric field circuit. I don't know about you, but I think I see similarities between, here we actually have one pole and the another pole of a magnet over here, representational underneath the ferrocell. I think I see the exact same thing here on the right as I do on the left. I would like for you to take a look at that.
You would like for us to take a look at that? That's kind of difficult considering that your expertise in photography doesn't seem to extend far enough to realize that imaging a computer screen doesn't really work that well.
Okay, a really old diagram from Charles Proteus Steinmetz, and over here we actually have the view of the magnet underneath the supercell. Both of these look exactly the same, do they not? They do.
Okay, if you ignore the scribblings over it, I think that this is the image he is trying to show, or something like this. On the left you have the image from Steinmetz's lecture, on the right you have the image from the ferrocell. Now, what can we learn from this? Well, firstly, when reading Steinmetz's lecture, we realize something important. He refers to the dotted lines as the dielectric field and the solid lines as the magnetic field. Now, reading this section is a bit confusing because it is horribly outdated, historically interesting, but scientifically useless. But that's by the by. Let's consider what Ken says about the ferrocell.
Everywhere you see light here is the magnetic. Everywhere you see the absence of light is the dielectric.
So according to that, if we were to draw a Steinmetz-like diagram of what Ken claims the ferrocell shows, we should get this. So no, they don't look alike. The thing with the ferrocell is that it does not show the field lines. Ferrocells are just two pieces of glass separated by a spacer. Then the gap between the pieces of glass is filled with diluted ferrofluid. This is actually easier said than done because, well, I tried it and it is quite tricky. Okay, the one I tried to make was 5mm by 5mm, so I could fit it into the sample holders for my equipment. And it didn't go well. Turns out the ferrofluid is really messy. Maybe I should have tried something bigger and less fiddly at first. But ferrofluid is nothing more than really fine iron filings suspended in mineral oil, and What you do with the ferrofluid is nothing more sophisticated than what you would do with iron filings on a piece of paper, but then in 3D. When you apply a magnetic field, the filings in the ferrofluid align with the magnetic field, and it is simple as that. When you shine a light through it, the light is scattered in interesting ways through that medium, and the lines you see in the ferrocell are actually perpendicular to the magnetic field lines. Now, this is not entirely useless, but the key thing that should tell you that the ferrocell images do not show the magnetic field lines is that the pattern changes depending on the angle you are looking from, the angle at which you are holding the light, how many lights you are using, and also, magnetic field lines are just an abstraction. They don't really exist. A magnetic field line is defined as a continuous line where the direction of the magnetic field is always tangential to the line, like this. Not this.
So let's get to describing magnetism and understand, this fundamental concept of the universe that's never been defined in any book, nor in any college as well. Sure it has, and no, it has not.
Now, it is really important to remember what we have gathered from the previous videos as per his requirements of a proper definition. For him to accept a definition, it has to be a statement about what something is, and it cannot include information about what it does. So let's see if he actually defines anything according to his own requirements.
In electrical circuits contain, this is a quote from Charles Proteus Steinmetz, I should have said that to begin with. An electrical discharges waves and impulses, his book. So this is from Charles Proteus Steinmetz. In electrical circuits containing energy stored in the magnetic and dielectric field, the change in the amount of stored energy occurs by a series of changes from magnetic to dielectric and back again from dielectric to magnetic stored energy.
Okay, just so you know, this is where the quote ends. Ken doesn't make this very clear.
It's because magnetism is the dielectric field. The conjugate force vector of energy, as meant inertia, being expressed as energy, but this expression, of course, is the dissipation of energy. All humanity throughout history has confused true energy with the release of energy. True energy is what humans call rest, and likewise humans consider force and motion as energy. But this is backwards, since force is the expression of the dissipation of energy.
Now, if you skirt over the details here, there's actually something quite important here. You can say that force is, for lack of a better word, the dissipation of potential energy, as in a force acting on an object acts to reduce the object's potential energy and converts it to kinetic energy. Now, you can even take the definition of entropy as the energy that is no longer available to do any work. And given that potential energy represents the energy available for an object to do work, and the second law of thermodynamics states that entropy must increase with time, you can actually restate the second law of thermodynamics as the amount of potential energy in the universe must decrease with time. However, a force is not the dissipation of energy as a whole. Whatever potential energy is lost is converted to the other type, which is kinetic energy. Now, on the other hand, I could just be trying too hard to bend Ken's nonsense into something that makes sense.
This is another quote from Steinmetz. The magnetic and dielectric field of the conductors are both included in the term electrical field and are the two components of the electrical field. You see, this is where modern science, and this I'm almost convinced is a real conspiracy, and I'm not a conspiracy theory person at all, because we think electricity is just this thing. And it's one thing. Electricity is not. The people that are the gods of electrical theory, Steinmetz, Faraday, Heaviside, Tesla, these people knew that electricity was a hybrid of dielectricity and magnetism. Phi times psi equals Q in Planck of electrification. Phi is the magnetic and psi is the dielectric. These two in conjunction create the electrical field.
Oh shit, we have an equation. Electricity is phi times psi, which is equal to Q, and Q is electrification. What can we tell from this? Well, not much, until we do a bit of digging, and maybe we should refer to his book. In Ken's book, he inserts a quote which contains the line, "Electricity is the product of phi, or magnetism, and psi, dielectricity." I wonder who said those wise words. Oh yes, he quotes himself. But anyway, from this we find out phi is magnetism, psi is dielectricity, and Q is electricity, which aren't nebulous definitions at all. We also find this gem in his book. Cool. Here we have the dielectric force given by phi over distance and time, and this is units of Weber per centimeter second. The Weber has dimensions of mass, distance squared, divided by current and time squared. So if we divide this by distance and time, we get mass times distance over current and time cubed. Now, this is not a force. This is a force per unit charge, or dielectric field strength. But anyway, we can also tell that if the dielectric force is phi over distance and time, and that it has these dimensions, then phi has dimensions of Weber, or magnetic flux. So this is shedding light on what he means with the word magnetism. When Ken says magnetism, it could just be that he means magnetic flux only. Next, he is saying that the magnetic force is dielectricity, or psi, divided by distance and time, and this has units of coulombs per centimeter second. That has dimensions of current over distance, and that is a magnetic field strength. Again, not quite a force. But we also see that dielectricity, or psi, has units of charge. So we know now that when Ken refers to dielectricity, he's actually referring to static charge. Now, this all comes from Steinmetz's elementary lectures on electric discharges, waves and impulses and other transients. Catchy title. But Ken messes this up by referring to these quantities as forces. Steinmetz called these quantities magnetic flux and dielectric flux. Magnetic flux, as Steinmetz used it, is still used today, and it is a useful quantity. The whole thing around dielectric flux and dielectric fields is actually that it was a really ham-fisted approach that comes from the fact that electromagnetic phenomena were not very well understood at the time. What he called the dielectric field was a shoe-in for a gap in our understanding. Steinmetz's lectures were written before we had discovered protons, and the behavior of electrons was still not very well understood. Steinmetz was a giant in his field, but the field was still not very advanced. A century has passed since Steinmetz wrote these lectures, and science has moved on quite a bit. Of course, cue the Electric Universe crowd commenting how Steinmetz, Heaviside and Tesla were the pioneers of electrical theory and that they built the 20th century. How could they do that if they didn't understand electrical theory? Well, they were right about many things, but they were also very wrong about many things, and that is just how it works. They had a description of electricity and magnetism which was useful, but the current description is far better. But let's take that argument and apply it to something else. Take fire, for example. Tuk-Tuk discovered fire around 1 million years ago and pioneered the concept of cooking. This allowed Tuk-Tuk to pre-digest food and increase calorie intake, and Mrs. Tuk-Tuk's babies had more developed brains because of this. Tuk-Tuk knew that if you rub some sticks together really fast, you can make fire. Tuk-Tuk also knew that too much fire was not a good thing, but if you wee on the fire, it goes away. Tuk-Tuk learned to control fire, and in doing so, Tuk-Tuk created a technology that allowed the human race to develop. And that's where you can see the flaw in the logic. Tuk-Tuk did not understand the process of combustion. He didn't have a description of friction or the brain. He had no concept of a calorie or how heating your food allows you to get more of these calories. But he had sufficient understanding to know that if you rub some dry sticks together, you can make a fire. Put a bit of meat over the fire and it goes all tasty. With this limited understanding, he laid the foundations for Homo sapiens to develop. Just because he managed to achieve this doesn't mean he has a better understanding of fire than we have today. If he had a better understanding, then he may have been able to build things like central heating, jet engines, and whiskey. Just because people like Steinmetz, Heaviside, and Tesla managed to build the cool stuff that they did, that doesn't mean that they had a better understanding of electricity and magnetism than we have today. If they did, then they would have been able to build things like hard drives, PV cells, and smartphones.
If you think you're smarter than Tesla or Charles Proteus Steinmetz or Oliver Heaviside, then you are an idiot. So I dare you to try to contradict me on that fact.
Ah, of course, a classic if you think that you are smarter than Gambit. Now I can turn this around on Ken. If you think you are smarter than Einstein, Pauli, Bohr, Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Brillouin, Debye, Bragg, Dirac, Compton, de Broglie, Born, Langmuir, Planck, Lorentz, Langevin, Chadwick, Thomson, Röntgen, Sommerfeld, Lorentz, Néel, Sturm, Feynman, Gell-Mann, Shockley, Bardeen, Zeeman, Becquerel, Michelson, Brown, von der Waals, von Lauer, Hertz, Compton, Fermi, Lawrence, Stern, Appleton, Bloch, Cherenkov, Landau, Guppert-Meyer, Weinberg. I can carry on with this list, but you get the point. Now, the problem is that despite what Ken's adherents would say, I do not assert that I am smarter than Steinmetz, Heaviside, or Tesla. In contrast, Ken asserts that he is smarter than all those people I listed, and on that basis alone, he falls down with his own argument. But this is an interesting play. Within the electric universe circles, there's a big contingent which is motivated by people feeling the need to be smarter than everyone else, and it is about people convincing themselves that they have access to secret knowledge that no one else has. But there is a downside to this. This belief requires you to think that you are smarter than everyone else. And ignoring Ken, I am yet to come across a person who is truly arrogant enough to think that. But by elevating a few people to a godlike level, he is giving you space to think that you are smarter than most people, but not all. And that is key because it allows you to feel superior whilst avoiding this conflict with your own humility. But here's the funny bit. Steinmetz actually rejected the concept of the ether and wrote one of the most important texts on general relativity. He was the first to present a simple formulation of the subject. Now, Heaviside also noticed some interesting features in Maxwell's equations. He already had an inkling of Lorentz-Fitzgerald contraction and, more importantly, the concept of relativistic mass. A lot of Heaviside's work actually led Einstein to formulate special relativity. So I'm sorry, Ken, but the more you hold these people as gods, the more your own nonsense falls apart.
That's actually the one thing that I think could be a possible conspiracy, because electricity is not one thing, nor is it a type of field modality. It is not. It is a hybrid of magnetism and dielectricity. This is another quote, and last quote from Steinmetz. Many textbooks speak of the electrical charges on the conductors and the energy stored by them without considering that the dielectric energy is not on the surface of the conductors but in the space outside of the conductor, just as is also the magnetic energy.
Once again, this is where the quote ends. I felt that this is important to point out.
There is no such thing as magnetism as implied in autonomous field modality. Wherever magnetism observed, there is a necessitated, again this is the Greek word, ananke.
But that is not what ananke means, and I have covered that before, but fuck it, you want to crowbar some ancient mysticism into this. I get it, it's attractive to your audience.
Conjugate presence, that being the dielectric. Magnetism is the dielectric field, as J.J. Thomson implied. Magnetism represents the force in motion, and toroidal field modality is expressed by the loss of inertia or energy of the dielectric in the system or object, in this case, of course, the magnet. It is not for any mere coincidence that more powerful magnets have smaller spatial fields, and all power, of course, rests on the dielectric. It is also no coincidence that the largest spatial magnetic fields are from weaker magnets, such as N35 and N40 Gauss.
Here we go again. As he's just repeating himself, I'll just repeat myself. Spatially smaller? What the actual hell are you talking about? Are you trying to say that the magnet producing a stronger field produces a weaker field? Because magnetic fields, regardless of how strong they are infinitely large. Now, their strength drops off rapidly with distance, but they'll never quite reach zero. Now, I have some pretty strong magnets, as in, if you have a pacemaker and you come close to my lab, you may die. But surely, according to your logic, these people should be fine, as long as they are nowhere near a fridge magnet.
Here, if I actually apply a couple diagrams to the previous diagram, here, you actually see the AC current, so I can actually apply the AC power lines, or I could just box it off and show you the magnet. Show you the exact same field structure between the dielectric and the magnetic and the conjugate to magnetodielectric geometries of the torus and the hyperboloid that actually form this, I'm going to use this saying loosely, this yin-yang, which comprise the whole, or in the case of the Greeks would be the holos.
Yep, more mysticism. As for the other stuff, I think that a previous bit covers this. You see, this is why it took me a while to get back around to doing stuff on Ken's content. It's just got a bit repetitive.
You know, this conjugate inseparability. And this inseparability is no different than speaking about principle and attribute, and no different than saying light and illumination. Do you think illumination is something different than light? We refer to light, and then we refer to illumination, but in referring to illumination, we're referring to light. I mean, these two are an inseparable conjugate substrate, which are there's nothing in the universe, too, whether seen or unseen, metaphysical or otherwise, that doesn't have at least one attribute. That's something that's an incredibly important point that only the ancient Pythagoreans would have taught you, and something you never learned in high school or college.
I have to say that this guy's a fucking master at making something really inane sound like something really profound, at least if you are gullible. Now, I have been receiving a lot of hate for covering Ken, mainly from people claiming that Ken is some enlightened being with a profound understanding of physics and the universe. It is actually really creepy, but what he said here is that light and illumination are two concepts that are not separable. Well, of course, illuminating something means that light is being shone onto the object, or simply put, you shine a light at something and then it is being illuminated, or shine a light onto an object, therefore you are shining a light onto the object. You're fucking kidding me.
It's not for any mere coincidence. I already know. Excuse me, I was repeating myself there.
Yeah, you have been repeating yourself quite a lot, but however much you repeat yourself, it is not going to make your nonsense any more true or coherent.
Force is always expansive, inertia and acceleration is always contractive. The countless people use the phrase dielectric force or dielectric alliance of force is 100% incorrect. This intellectual defect actually has to end. Expanding and contracting circles, again, they presume lines of force are that are torsional to the magnet or object, be it atomic scale or palpable magnetic scale, define what we conceptualize as magnetism. This is necessitatively so the lowest simplex pressure mediation that defines magnetic presence.
What I find most impressive is that it was 37 seconds since I last interrupted him, and nothing he said was coherent. But what he doesn't realize is that the dielectric medium between both illogical field incommensurability equalization is that action on electricity that magnetism itself will lucidly recognize scattered in electrification. Now, this necessitates dielectricity vortex patterns identical to magnetism gradients when being counterspatially accumulative. Now, if you are not familiar with the word salad generator, then look in the description.
Magnetism and space are but one and the same, the loss of inertia or power in the dielectric, which is incalculable.
Wait, hold on. Now you are saying that magnetism and space are one and the same. But we've already covered that in your framework, magnetism has dimensions of mass times distance squared divided by current and time squared. But space has dimensions of distance. So can you please tell me where the extra dimensions come from? But also, it is incalculable. So you are now presenting something which we cannot quantify and therefore not verify or falsify. Now, considering that you think that you are pretty hot on philosophy, I think you may need to revisit some very basic concepts.
And manifests in an inverse incommensurable infinity, which is space, which has no properties, only attributes, and exists wholly due to magnetic divergence alone, which is the force and motion manifestation of the loss of dielectric capacitance.
This is really annoying me. I'd hoped to finish the whole thing off in one video. The issue is that I recorded this stuff on part 1 through to 5 over a couple of weeks around the December holidays. I didn't record the stuff on part 6 because I ran out of time and I decided not to squeeze that into my schedules. Things were getting a bit hectic. I figured that I could also wait for some audience response to tailor my final videos to the reception of the earlier ones. I had also hoped on doing a big blowout finale in one go, but I just can't hack it, and considering that this video has already reached insert current duration here, I doubt that you can either. But Don't worry, some of his greatest hits are still to come, and I have a few more interesting bits to cover. So I would like to thank my awesome patrons who know who they are and they rock, and thank you all for watching. Until next time.
Induction, induction, induction. Induction, induction. Induction, induction. Induction, induction. Induction, induction. Ball, induction, sphere, induction, ball, sphere, ball, induction, sphere, induction, ball, sphere, ball, induction, sphere, induction, ball, sphere, ball, induction, ball, induction, sphere, 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 sphere. Ball, induction, sphere, induction, ball, sphere, ball, induction, sphere, induction, ball, sphere, ball, induction, sphere, induction, ball, sphere, ball, induction, sphere, induction, ball, sphere. Gravity is not an autonomous field modality.
The fuck did you just say?
Ball, induction, sphere, induction,